Anger, denial, bargaining, depression, and acceptance are considered the 5 stages of grief. Taylor Swift's 11th studio album, The Tortured Poets Department, is in her consideration her stage of acceptance, and her last 5 albums together are the 5 stages of grief. The 5 stages of grief are not ones that are gone through linearly. They are gone through over and over again until we finally reach acceptance. And even then, acceptance is something that we are constantly going back to. So how can we finally get to acceptance? How can we finally make peace with what happened and move forward? It is first and foremost a decision that we must come to by processing the feelings of what happened. When you are going through grief, you are not just grieving the person or the situation or the job or the place. You are grieving what you thought that place was going to be for you, that person was going to mean to you, what future you had together. And at times the past itself is also in question, the version of yourself that you had to let go, the version of yourself that you wanted to become, the version of yourself that you never could be. Grief is just as much grieving what happened and what never did happen. Grief is multi-layered and multi-stages, and it is something that we function with constantly and throughout our lives. And the first thing that we really need to get through is the emotions, and the best way to do that is to sit with them, to write about them, and to allow them to exist. A lot of the times when we go through something, the first thing someone tells us is just forget about it, just move on, don't think about them, let them go. And of course that is all part of the process, but it's not something that you can do up front, because you will question it, you will go through those stages many more times. You will probably get stuck in the bargaining stage if you just try to steamroll over your past and the history that you have with that person, because you'll question, why did this happen? What went wrong? Did I miss something? And you're gonna ask these questions over and over again unless you sit with the emotions and let them bubble up to the surface and be present with them. You have to feel through what you just went through, whether it was losing a loved one, losing a job, losing a friendship, losing a relationship. You have to sit with this idea that this person, this place is no longer in your life in the same capacity, and that you have to see them through this different light. And you have to, as much as you aren't steamrolling over it, you can't also put it in a light that it doesn't exist in. You have to stop fantasizing about what that person was and what they meant to you. You have to see what actually happened for what it was instead of what you wanted it to be. Instead of trying to change it retroactively, you have to take a step back and accept it for what it was. There's probably many lessons that you can take away, and at the very beginning that might be too hard for you to accept, but that could be a way that you write about it. Another way could be you just write out the story. You're writing a letter to that person, you're writing a letter to yourself, who was that version of you. But either way, you need to write it out. This is stuff that you never necessarily have to read again. This is probably stuff you shouldn't share with anyone else unless it's a therapist and they can help you process through it. But you really need to work through those emotions, and you will go through those stages of anger, denial, bargaining, and depression as you are feeling through these emotions. And you're probably going to feel the first 3. You're going to be angry about what happened. You're going to feel wronged. You're going to feel like it wasn't fair. And all of that is something that you need to feel. Otherwise, it's going to bubble up in your life when you least expect it and when you don't want to. You're going to question what you did. You're going to question how you could have changed things, how it could have been different. You're going to want to look towards the future and think about what could have been, and you're going to deny that it's not going to happen. You're going to be like, that's not actually what happened, that's not who they are. And you're going to go through those first 3 stages over and over again as you process these emotions. And as you think you're done with one, it'll bleed into the next. But you have to keep going through and letting them come to the surface. And once you have really thought through all of those questions and done that, you will probably be really tired and have tired yourself out. There's only so much that you can think about it. until you get to the depression stage, where you will slink back into this version of yourself that is just a shell of who you are, because you're just going to be questioning and wondering and hoping and just miserable because you're thinking about it, and all of those things that were pretty active, denial and anger and bargaining, are all pretty active emotions. Depression is when you just kind of sit back and you're like, wow, I cannot believe this happened. And then something will spark you and you might get angry again, and then you might start denying again, and then you might start questioning yourself again. So there you will run through these emotions over and over again, and I encourage you to feel through them and not to anesthetize with another person or any other ways that people can anesthetize emotions. You will not die from feeling those emotions. You might cry, you might scream, you might feel deep hurt and feel like you'll never get through it. That emotion isn't going to hurt you. What is going to hurt you is trying to outrun them. It's either going to hurt you in that moment by the choices and the ways you're choosing to not feel this, or by legitimately just hurting your own feelings by thinking about that and having to eventually come back to this same topic with probably another layer that you also have to deal with. Deal with it up front. You can do that through writing it down, write a letter to that person, write a letter to yourself, never send these letters, create a letter of forgiveness to yourself, to the version of yourself, to that person. If forgiving them is going to help you move on, you need to do that. You don't have to forgive them by texting them. You can just forgive them one day and decide to move on, but you will have to feel through these emotions, and as soon as you think you're done with it, something's going to trigger that person, that place, and you will feel like you have to undo that. All the work that you've done has been undone, but it hasn't, because you've gone through it, you've had those questions, you've let the emotions sit, and as long as you're allowing these emotions to sit, you are moving forward. So move forward where you can, when you can, and just keep going. And to relate this to the songs that Taylor Swift put out, you can really see the range of what she writes about, from Maddie Healy to Joe Alwyn to becoming famous at a young age, to her Kanye West and Kim Kardashian situation, to all of these different things that she's had to witness and grieve. And you can see the range of emotions that she's gone through. And she talks about something very important in one of her songs where she says, I just had to keep smiling and keep going. And that brings me into the next thing that you're gonna have to deal with and try to not fall into, is you're gonna have to keep living your life regardless of what's going on in the grief that you're feeling. Maybe you get a few days, a week, a few weeks to really process, where you can step away from your job or other people and really feel those emotions. A lot of the times you don't get that freedom to do so. You have to continue to feed the dog, or you have to continue to go to work, or you have to continue to talk to people. In some way or another, you're gonna have to just force yourself to keep smiling and to keep going. And some of the things that can lead up to grief is also overworking yourself and not giving yourself any space to feel your emotions, and to just work really long days and ignore how much you don't like being at that job or those people or the relationship you're in. And I strongly encourage you to not do that, regardless of the grief level or stage that you're in, because that is another way that you're processing grief, through denial. By just working all the time, running yourself in circles, you are causing denial to become a very big part of your life. Not to say that working hard and putting your heart and soul into something, and of course for her, songwriting is a way to express her emotions and for her to process it, but you don't have to overdo it. You don't have to release the next great thing while you're dealing with one of the hardest things that you are experiencing. And grief is something that is going to ask a lot of you. It's going to ask you to sit with it. It's going to ask you to demand its attention, and it's going to be something that never truly leaves you, which is something that isn't often talked about, that grief is something that we are consistently feeling throughout life, which is why acceptance is also something that we constantly have to go back to. So just as much as acceptance is something we constantly are doing, grief is something that we're constantly feeling, and you are going to get better at doing so if you do these steps, if you don't let these emotions take control of you completely. Let them come to the surface, let them be present, and don't let them be the reason why you do things. Don't let denial or anger be your motivation, because some days those things will run out. Someday you will step into acceptance, whether enough time has just elapsed and you're not thinking about them as much just because you have other experiences to think about. If they're your prime motivation to do things, what is going to happen when they're not there? You need to have better reasons to do things, to change things in your life than hating someone, than wanting revenge. You need good emotions, and those are finding joy in the things that you do, finding peace with talking to certain people, finding peace in a place that you go to. You have to have better reasons for doing the things that you do, because the stages of grief will be the things that hurt you in the long run if you make those your prime motivation for doing things. And letting go, accepting, moving on is a much better place to be in creatively, energetically, but you can't get there if you are keeping yourself stuck. So don't let yourself get stuck by believing that grief is something that you'll always have to deal with. And it's a learning process, it's a learning curve. There are moments where things happen that I feel like I go right back to where that first hurt happened, to that moment where I was told I was no longer be with that company. There are things that trigger me right back to that moment, and it feels like all that work has been undone, but it hasn't. It just is something that you have to keep flexing. It's like a muscle that you're growing, and that muscle will only keep getting better and growing if you put in the work to get through it. So make sure you're writing when you can, sharing with trusted people, whether that be a therapist or really close friends. I wouldn't talk about it with everyone that you know. There should be a few trusted people, or write it down and you don't have to read it. If you're filling out many pages, you don't have to go back and read everything. Just the act of processing it, putting on paper will do that for you. Now, with all of that being said, and grief being something that is just going to be a constant, acceptance is truly a choice that you make one day. Acceptance is, I've looked at every scenario. I've been mad. I've denied it. I've tried to talk my way out of it. I've tried to be a different version than this scenario has forced me into. I've been sad. I've sat there, and at some point you just realize enough is enough and you have to move on, because there's nothing left for you there. Those people, that job, that place, they aren't serving you anymore. And though grief is not something that you'll ever truly let go of, it is something that gets to hold you back for as long as you allow it. Now, they say that how long will grief be there? Well, how long is that thing going to stay gone? And depending on what it is that you're grieving, that grief will surface more often and more intensely for certain scenarios, some worse than others. And though grief will be something that you carry with you for the rest of your life, it is something that you get to choose how much it impacts you. Some days you'll have to sit there for an hour and just think back on the past, and hopefully you can end that thought of that person with the conclusion that I can't do anything to change this. I have to accept it for what it was, and that there's nothing left for me there. I have to move on. I have to say goodbye. There's that person who loved that other person, or that job, or that place also no longer exists. And that is something that is not often talked about, that the biggest grief that you're going through is the letting go of the version of yourself that allowed that person to be in your life, that allowed those scenarios and those situations. And you have to forgive that person as much as you have to let them go, which in and of itself is really hard. You are no longer that person who allowed that behavior, who allowed those circumstances in your life, and you're grieving that person. And when something dies, it fights for its life, it screams and it cries and it hurts, and you just have to let it go. You just have to move on. And at the end of the day, it's hard to accept it, but it is that acceptance that gives you the freedom to move on and to create more experiences, which you'll probably grieve someday too, but at least you'll be grieving a new person, a new place, and a new version of yourself because you allowed yourself to grow. There's many people who get stuck in the denial phase and never get out of it. How many people do you know that live in denial? They're stuck in that grief stage of denial and they never want to get into the next stage, or they get into depression, then they go back to denial, but they never get to acceptance. We deny so many parts of ourselves, so many important parts of ourselves, because it's easier that way, or so we think. But remember who you're sacrificing in the long term. Not only did you have to lose this person or this place, this job, but now you're also losing your new version of yourself. So it can tip into it being much worse for you. And I think that's where Taylor Swift got to. She got to this point where she's like, I can't keep writing all of these songs and not have a conclusion of what it means. I need to move forward and I need to let it go. And that's why so many of her songs cover an array of people that she's met and situations she's been in. I think she finally came to a point where she was just tired of being tired of her life and her circumstances, and she wanted to take her power back. And you can see that where she's playing pickleball or sewing and cooking. At some point you have to accept that this is your life, and you not only have the responsibility but the obligation to create the life that you want. And grief will follow you for the rest of your life, but you have to decide that enough is enough at some point. And you will go through those stages one more time, many more times, but you will get through it easier and easier. And you'll sit with grief many times and she'll talk to you, but you have to accept that what happened happened, and that acceptance is a choice that only you get to make. I hope to see you soon. Have a great week.